On the morning of July the 18th, 1915, a peculiar blueprint landed on the desk of Winston Churchill at the British Admiralty, and with it, the seed of a revolution in warfare that would shake the trenches of Europe. The document bore the signature of a man whose name would echo through military history, yet whose origins were as humble as the coal-fired ships he once served upon. Lieutenant Commander Thomas George Hetherington stood in the dim corridors of the Royal Navy's Engineering Division, clutching a rolled sheaf of papers that colleagues had already dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. The electrician-turned-officer had spent 18 months watching young men march into machine gun fire across no man's land, their bodies torn apart before they could advance 50 yards. The stalemate on the Western Front had become a meat grinder, consuming an entire generation while generals argued over maps in comfortable chateau miles from the killing fields. Hetherington's proposal was radical to the point of absurdity: a mechanized, armored vehicle that could roll over barbed wire, deflect machine gun bullets, and deliver troops directly into enemy trenches. He called it a landship, though others would soon give it a more ominous name. What made his colleagues recoil in horror was not merely the concept, but his insistence that he would personally command the prototype in combat. A suicide mission, declared Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Hall when he first reviewed the schematics. No rational man would climb inside such a coffin. The son of a Manchester factory foreman, Hetherington had joined the Royal Navy at 16, his hands already calloused from years of apprentice work in the industrial heartland of England. He understood electricity when it was still a mysterious force to most military men, and he possessed an engineer's mind that saw solutions where others saw only problems. By 1912, he had risen through the enlisted ranks to become one of the Navy's most respected electrical specialists, earning his commission through merit rather than aristocratic birth. But the war had changed him. Hetherington had volunteered for temporary duty with the Royal Naval Division in France during the autumn of 1914, and what he witnessed at the First Battle of Ypres haunted him. He watched the flower of British youth cut down in waves, their courage and determination rendered meaningless by the mechanical efficiency of German machine guns. Officers on horseback, trained in the cavalry traditions of the previous century, ordered bayonet charges against fortified positions as if elan and spirit could overcome modern weaponry. According to records preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, Hetherington returned to England in December of 1914 with a singular obsession. There had to be a way to protect men as they crossed the killing ground. He began sketching designs in his off-duty hours, consulting with automotive engineers, studying the agricultural tractors that were beginning to appear on British farms, and corresponding with inventors who had proposed armored vehicles in years past. His initial designs were crude, almost comical. Early sketches showed what looked like an iron-plated omnibus mounted on tank treads with gun ports cut into the sides like a medieval castle. Fellow officers laughed when they saw them. Even sympathetic colleagues gently suggested that Hetherington should return to his electrical duties and leave military innovation to those with proper training in tactics and strategy. But the electrician possessed something that many career officers lacked. He had stood in the mud with ordinary soldiers, and he refused to accept their deaths as inevitable. The First Lord of the Admiralty was known for entertaining unconventional ideas, and Winston Churchill's office had become a magnet for inventors, visionaries, and crackpots since the war began. On July the 23rd, 1915, Hetherington was granted 15 minutes to present his proposal. He arrived with a wooden model, meticulously constructed in the workshop, showing a rhomboid-shaped vehicle with tracks running around its entire perimeter. Churchill listened, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, as the naval officer explained his vision. The machine would weigh approximately 30 tons, powered by a Daimler engine producing 105 horsepower. Its armor would be thick enough to deflect rifle and machine gun fire, though Hetherington admitted it would be vulnerable to artillery. Most importantly, it could cross trenches up to 12 feet wide and crush barbed wire, obstacles that had stopped every infantry assault since the trench lines had solidified. "And you intend to ride this contraption yourself?" Churchill asked, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. "Sir, I cannot ask other men to trust their lives to a machine I would not trust with my own," Hetherington replied. The answer apparently satisfied something in Churchill's character, for the First Lord immediately ordered the formation of the Landships Committee, allocating initial funds for experimental development. The project was shrouded in secrecy from its inception. To disguise the true nature of the vehicles being constructed, workers were told they were building mobile water tanks for the Mesopotamian campaign. The name stuck, shortened simply to tanks, a designation that would become synonymous with armored warfare. The first prototype, nicknamed Little Willie, emerged from the workshops of William Foster and Company in Lincoln during September of 1915. Hetherington was present for every welding job, every mechanical test, every incremental improvement. He worked alongside the civilian engineers, his Navy uniform often covered in grease and metal filings. The prototype was far from perfect. It could barely reach 3 miles per hour. Its steering mechanism required 2 men operating separate gearboxes, and the interior became so hot during operation that crew members frequently fainted. The noise was tremendous. the fumes from the engine nearly asphyxiating, and the ride so violent that men emerged from tests with bruises and split lips from being thrown against the metal interior. Little Willie was quickly deemed inadequate, and a second design emerged. Mother, as it was called, incorporated Hetherington's most radical innovation, the rhomboid shape with tracks extending around the entire hull, allowing it to cross wider trenches and navigate more difficult terrain. This design, later designated the Mark I, would become the template for British tank development, as detailed in military historian J.F.C. Fuller's account Tanks in the Great War, published in 1920. The development process was plagued by skepticism from conventional military authorities. General Sir Douglas Haig, commanding British forces in France, initially dismissed the tanks as a pretty mechanical toy with little practical military value. Artillery officers argued that existing guns could destroy any armored vehicle. Infantry commanders questioned whether soldiers would follow such ungainly machines into battle. Hetherington faced another obstacle. He was not a combat officer in the traditional sense. His commission was technical, and many questioned whether an electrician had any business commanding troops in battle. The class-conscious British Army of 1915 was still dominated by officers from public schools and landed families, men who had been groomed for command since childhood. That a former enlisted man of working-class origins should presume to lead soldiers into combat struck many as inappropriate, even offensive, but Hetherington had an unexpected ally. Colonel Ernest Swinton, who had been appointed to oversee tank development, recognized in the naval officer a rare combination of technical expertise and genuine tactical insight. Swinton ensured that Hetherington remained central to the project, and when the time came to select crews for the first combat deployment, he supported the electrician's insistence on leading from the front. By August of 1916, the British had manufactured 49 Mark I tanks, divided between male variants armed with naval 6-pounder guns and female variants carrying machine guns. The crews, drawn from the motor machine gun service, underwent hasty training at a facility in Elvedon, Suffolk. They practiced navigating obstacles, coordinating movement, and operating the complex controls in conditions that simulated combat as closely as possible. The dawn of September 15, 1916, broke grey and miserable over the Somme Valley, and with it came the moment that would test everything Hetherington had built. The Battle of the Somme had been raging since July 1, consuming British divisions in exchange for negligible territorial gains. General Haig, desperate for any advantage, had agreed to deploy the new tanks despite reservations from his staff. 49 machines were allocated to the offensive, though mechanical failures would reduce that number before the attack even began. Hetherington commanded tank number 721, christened Daredevil by her crew. The name was grimly appropriate. The tank's interior was a claustrophobic nightmare of exposed machinery, scorching metal surfaces, and barely controlled violence. The commander's position offered limited visibility through narrow vision slits, and communication with the crew required shouting over the deafening roar of the engine and the clanking of the tracks. The temperature inside quickly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air became thick with carbon monoxide fumes and the acrid smell of hot oil. His crew consisted of 7 men besides himself, a driver, 2 gearsmen who operated the track brakes for steering, 3 gunners, and a loader. Most had been taxi drivers, bus operators, or mechanics before the war, men who understood machinery but had little combat experience. They looked to Hetherington with a mixture of trust and barely concealed terror. None of them had any illusion about their survival chances if the tank was disabled in no man's land. The objective was the village of Flers, a cluster of ruined buildings held by German troops and transformed into a fortified strongpoint. British infantry had attacked the position repeatedly over the previous weeks, each assault breaking against German machine gun positions and barbed wire defenses that extended hundreds of yards in depth. Thousands had died for a few hundred yards of cratered mud. At 6:20 in the morning, Hetherington gave the order to advance. Daredevil lurched forward, climbing out of the assembly trench and into the grey light of dawn. Through his narrow vision slit, he could see the torn landscape of the Somme, shell holes filled with stagnant water, tangles of rusted wire, the scattered detritus of previous failed attacks, and bodies, always bodies in various states of decay, British and German alike. The plan called for the tanks to advance ahead of the infantry, crushing wire and suppressing German positions. Reality proved far more complicated. Of the 49 tanks allocated, only 32 even made it to the starting line. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the machines, and several became ditched in shell holes before reaching the German lines. Hetherington watched through his vision slit as tanks to his left and right foundered, their crews forced to abandon the vehicles and fight as infantry. Daredevil pressed on. The sensation of crossing no man's land in the tank was surreal, almost dreamlike. The machine rocked and pitched over the uneven ground, occasionally becoming airborne as it crossed trenches. Inside, the crew was thrown violently about, saved from serious injury only by the cramped quarters that prevented them from building momentum. One of the gearsmen vomited from a combination of heat, fumes, and motion sickness. The driver, a former London cabby named Private Henry Atkinson, maintained his course through sheer force of will, following Hetherington's shouted directions. German machine gun fire began almost immediately, bullets clanging off the armor like metal rain. The sound was terrifying, each impact reverberating through the tank's interior. Shrapnel found its way through vision slits and ventilation ports, and one of the gunners took a fragment in the shoulder but continued working his weapon. The 6-pounder gun fired, the concussion in the enclosed space momentarily deafening everyone inside. According to the after-action report filed with the Tank Corps' headquarters and now preserved in the National Archives at Kew, Daredevil reached the German forward trench line at approximately 7:15. Hetherington ordered the driver to pivot and drive along the trench line, allowing the gunners to fire down into the fortifications. German soldiers, many of whom had never seen a tank before, scattered in confusion. Some threw grenades that bounced harmlessly off the armor, others simply ran, but the machine was taking damage. German artillery observers had spotted the advancing tanks, and high-explosive shells began falling around Daredevil with increasing accuracy. A near miss showered the tank with debris, and shrapnel punctured the fuel tank, sending petrol streaming across the hot engine. Hetherington smelled it immediately, that distinctive throat-catching reek that every engineer dreaded. Inside the metal coffin, with temperatures already exceeding human endurance, a fuel fire meant certain death. "Keep moving," he roared to Atkinson, even as he grabbed a fire extinguisher and moved toward the engine compartment. The tank lurched forward, crushing a section of barbed wire beneath its tracks. Through the vision slit, Hetherington could see British infantry beginning their advance, moving behind the tanks in sections, using the machines as mobile cover. Everything they had planned for was happening, but Daredevil was becoming a death trap. A second shell struck closer, the concussion slamming everyone inside against the metal walls. The loader, a teenager from Birmingham named Private James Walsh, collapsed unconscious, blood streaming from his nose. One of the gearsmen, Corporal Frederick Davies, took over Walsh's position without being ordered, maintaining the rate of fire. The professionalism of the crew, their refusal to panic even as their vehicle transformed into a mobile furnace, would later become legendary in Tank Corps annals. The fuel leak worsened. Small flames danced across the engine housing, and smoke began filling the already fetid air. Hetherington made a calculation that would define the rest of his military career. They were less than 200 yards from the German second trench line, the true defensive position that had stopped every British attack for weeks. If Daredevil could reach that trench, could suppress the machine gun positions there, the infantry following them would have a chance to consolidate the captured ground. "Full speed ahead," he ordered. His voice steady despite the growing inferno around him. "We're taking that second line." Atkinson, his face already blistered from the heat, somehow coaxed more speed from the damaged machine. The tank accelerated to nearly 4 miles per hour, an ungainly charge across ground created by artillery. German defenders in the second trench, alerted by the destruction of their forward positions, concentrated their fire. Machine gun bullets struck the tank in a continuous stream, finding every weak point in the armor. A bullet ricocheted through a vision slit and struck one of the gunners in the leg, but the man continued loading his weapon, using his belt as a hasty tourniquet. The flames inside the tank grew stronger. Hetherington abandoned the fire extinguisher, which had proven useless against the fuel-fed blaze, and instead focused on keeping his crew functional. He rotated positions, allowing overheated crew members brief respites near the forward compartment, where the air was slightly less poisonous. He shouted constant updates and encouragement, his leadership preventing the kind of panic that would have turned the situation from desperate to catastrophic. At 7:37, according to testimony later given by infantry officers who witnessed the assault, Daredevil reached the German second trench. The tank's appearance triggered near panic among the defenders. Many German soldiers had heard rumors of the new British tanks but assumed they were propaganda. Confronting the reality of a 30-ton armored vehicle emerging from the smoke and chaos, apparently unstoppable despite being on fire, shattered the nerve of even veteran troops. Hetherington ordered the tank positioned lengthwise along the trench, blocking a communication passage and allowing both 6-pounder guns to enfilade the defensive position. The crew fired until their ammunition was nearly exhausted, each shell creating carnage among the packed defenders. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. German soldiers began surrendering in groups, many throwing down their weapons and climbing from their trenches with hands raised. The British infantry, advancing behind the tanks, reached the position and began consolidating their hold. For the first time in months of grinding attrition, they had broken through German defenses with manageable casualties. Young lieutenants stared in wonder at Daredevil, this smoking, battle-scarred machine that had accomplished what months of artillery bombardment could not. Inside the tank, Hetherington faced an agonizing decision. The fire was now completely out of control, flames visible through several breaches in the armor. The heat had become genuinely life-threatening, with the metal interior glowing dull red in places. Walsh had regained consciousness but was clearly suffering from heat stroke and carbon monoxide poisoning. 2 other crew members were injured and all showed signs of severe heat exhaustion. The textbook decision was obvious: evacuate immediately, but the tactical situation remained fluid. German counterattacks could be expected within minutes, and Daredevil, even disabled and burning, provided cover for the infantry consolidating the captured trench. If the crew evacuated, they would lose the tank's protective bulk and its remaining armament. Hetherington gathered his crew around him in the forward compartment, the only area not yet consumed by flames. 7 men, most barely into their 20s, looked to him for orders. Their faces were blackened by smoke, blistered by heat, streaked with blood and oil. Every one of them understood they should already be dead. Private Atkinson's hands were so badly burned he could no longer grip the controls. Corporal Davies had lost consciousness twice from the fumes, yet they waited for their commander's decision with the discipline that only comes from absolute trust. "Gentlemen," Hetherington said, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation, "we've accomplished our primary objective. The infantry has the trench. You've all performed magnificently, far beyond anything I could have asked. Now I'm ordering you to evacuate, get to the captured trench and help consolidate the position. That's a direct order." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm staying with Daredevil." The response was immediate and unanimous. Atkinson, despite his ruined hands, spoke for them all. "Respectfully, sir, we're not leaving without you." What followed was later described in military dispatches as an extraordinary display of devotion to duty. The crew refused evacuation, orders from their commanding officer, an act that technically constituted insubordination. Instead, they set about fighting the fire with renewed determination, using empty ammunition cases to scoop dirt and mud through the gun ports, suffocating the flames section by section. When that proved insufficient, they urinated on the flames, then used their own uniforms as improvised fire blankets. The effort was documented by Captain Richard Henderson, an infantry officer who had reached the captured trench and witnessed the scene through field glasses. His diary entry, now held in the Lytle collection at the University of Leeds, describes watching the tank crew's desperate firefighting efforts while German counterattacks began forming in the distance. Henderson wrote, "They should have abandoned that machine, any reasonable man would have, but there was nothing reasonable about what we witnessed that day. It was madness. It was magnificent." Hetherington realized that his crew would not abandon him, which meant he had to either evacuate with them or find a way to save the tank. He chose the latter, working with Davies and the least injured gunner. He managed to access the damaged fuel system and manually sealed the leak using a combination of mud, fabric, and mechanical wire. The work required him to reach into spaces where the metal was hot enough to raise blisters instantly, performing delicate repairs while the tank continued to rock from nearby artillery impacts. German counterattacks materialized at 8:15. Infantry supported by machine gun teams moved toward the captured positions, attempting to retake the lost ground before the British could fortify it. This was the pattern that had repeated endlessly throughout the Somme offensive. Attack, brief success, devastating counterattack, return to status quo. But this time, Daredevil changed the equation. Despite the damage, despite the fire, despite having only minimal ammunition remaining, Hetherington brought the tank's weapons back into action. The 6-pounders fired their final shells at near point-blank range, breaking up German assault formations. When the main guns were empty, the crew used the machine guns, firing disciplined bursts at any concentration of enemy troops. The psychological impact of the burning battle-scarred tank continuing to fight was devastating to German morale. The counterattacks faltered, then broke. German troops who had routinely executed textbook offensive operations against British positions found themselves unable to advance against the combination of entrenched infantry and the seemingly indestructible metal monster that refused to die. By 9 o'clock, the British hold on the second trench line was secure. Daredevil had held the position during the most critical hours, and Hetherington's decision to remain in action had prevented what might have been another costly failure. Only then did he order evacuation. The crew emerged from the tank like damned souls escaping hell itself. Their clothing was in tatters, their skin blistered and blackened, their lungs damaged from hours of breathing superheated toxic air. Walsh had to be carried, and Atkinson's hands would require extensive medical treatment. But they were alive, and they had accomplished something that would reshape modern warfare. British medical officers who examined the crew later expressed astonishment that anyone had survived the conditions inside the tank. The interior temperature had exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe heat stroke within minutes. The carbon monoxide concentration would have been lethal with prolonged exposure. The combination of concussion effects from shell impacts, flying shrapnel, and the violent motion of the vehicle should have incapacitated the crew long before they completed their mission, according to research compiled by military historian David Fletcher in his comprehensive work, The British Tanks, 1915 to 1919. Hetherington's crew spent approximately 3 hours inside Daredevil under combat conditions that exceeded all safety parameters. No training exercise had prepared them for the reality, yet their performance established standards for tank crews that would persist throughout the century. Their refusal to abandon their vehicle, their continued effectiveness despite catastrophic damage, became the template for armored warfare doctrine. The sun was high over the Somme by the time medical orderlies loaded Hetherington and his crew onto stretchers for transport to the field hospital. The electrician turned tank commander insisted on walking, though his legs barely supported him, wanting the infantry who had followed Daredevil into battle to see that the crew had survived. It was a calculated gesture of leadership, demonstrating that the new machines, while dangerous, were not the metal coffins that pessimists had predicted. News of the tank attack spread rapidly through the British Expeditionary Force. Of the 32 tanks that had actually engaged the BS enemy on September the 15th, only 9 had completed their objectives. The majority had broken down, become ditched, or been disabled by artillery fire. Yet those 9 had achieved more in a few hours than weeks of traditional infantry assaults. Daredevil's action, in particular, captured the imagination of soldiers who had watched their comrades die in futile attacks against fortified positions. General Haig, who had been skeptical about the tank's potential, modified his assessment after reviewing the results. In a communique to the War Office dated September the 20th, 1916, he requested 1,000 additional tanks for future operations. The request reflected a dramatic shift in British military thinking. Though the technology would require another year of development before reaching its full potential, Hetherington spent 2 weeks in hospital recovering from burns, smoke inhalation, and heat exhaustion. During his convalescence, he received visits from journalists, military officials, and even members of parliament who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of tank warfare. He deflected attention from himself, consistently praising his crew and the civilian engineers who had built the machines. When a reporter from the Times asked whether he had been afraid during the battle, Hetherington replied simply, "Terror would be a more accurate description, but fear and duty can coexist." The crew of Daredevil received commendations, though the British military system of 1916 struggled to appropriately recognize such unprecedented actions. Private Atkinson was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his driving under extreme conditions. Corporal Davies received the Military Medal for his initiative in maintaining the tank's weapons systems despite injuries. The others received mentions in dispatches, an honor that seemed inadequate given their accomplishments but reflected the military bureaucracy's uncertainty about how to evaluate tank warfare. Hetherington himself received promotion to commander and appointment as chief instructor for the newly formed Tank Corps training facility. The promotion came with a private meeting with Winston Churchill, who had championed the tank program despite opposition from conventional military authorities. Churchill, according to records maintained in the Churchill Archives Center at Cambridge University, told Hetherington, "You have vindicated my faith in mechanical warfare. More importantly, you have proven that technology requires men of vision to employ it effectively. The tanks are formidable, but leadership made them decisive." The meeting with Churchill revealed another dimension of Hetherington's achievement. The British military in 1916 remained deeply class-conscious, with working-class officers like Hetherington facing subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination from their aristocratic colleagues. His technical background, rather than traditional combat command experience, had made many senior officers question his fitness for leadership. The success of Daredevil challenged those assumptions, demonstrating that industrial expertise and engineering knowledge were becoming as vital to modern warfare as cavalry traditions and infantry tactics. But success brought complications. The Tank Corps expanded rapidly after the Somme offensive, and Hetherington found himself pulled between competing demands. Military authorities wanted him to train new crews, passing on the hard-won lessons from Daredevil's combat debut. Engineers and designers sought his input on improving tank designs, recognizing that his combat experience provided insights no amount of theoretical planning could replicate. And wounded pride among conventional officers created subtle resistance to the new armored force, with some senior commanders viewing tanks as expensive novelties that diverted resources from traditional branches. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became a period of intense development. Hetherington worked 16-hour days at the training facility in Bovington, Dorset, personally instructing the first generation of tank commanders. He emphasized psychological preparation as much as technical skill, knowing that the claustrophobic, nightmarish conditions inside a tank would break men who were not mentally prepared. His training regime was brutal, deliberately subjecting crews to heat, noise, and disorientation to simulate combat conditions. Commander Hetherington believes that training should be more difficult than actual combat, wrote one trainee in a letter home. Now preserved in the Imperial War Museum's document collection, he is probably correct, though I pray I never experienced conditions worse than his training exercises. The letter's author, Lieutenant Arnold Thompson, would later command a tank at the Battle of Cambrai and credited Hetherington's harsh preparation for his survival. During this period, Hetherington also contributed to technical improvements in tank design. The Mark I tanks that had fought at the Somme were first-generation prototypes, and their weaknesses had become apparent in combat. Working with civilian engineers, Hetherington advocated for better ventilation systems, improved visibility for commanders, and more reliable steering mechanisms. His suggestions, grounded in actual combat experience, influenced the design of the Mark IV tanks that would see service in 1917 and 1918. By November of 1917, the Tank Corps had expanded to 4 battalions with nearly 400 vehicles. The machines had evolved significantly from the crude prototypes that had fought at the Somme. Mark IV tanks incorporated many of Hetherington's suggested improvements, and tactics had developed to maximize their effectiveness. Yet the electrician-turned-commander, now regarded as one of the tank corps' founding fathers, had spent more than a year away from combat, training others while the war continued to consume a generation of European youth. The Battle of Cambrai, planned for November 20th, 1917, would be the first large-scale tank offensive in military history. 476 tanks would attack on a 6-mile front, attempting to break through the formidable Hindenburg Line without the traditional preliminary artillery bombardment. The element of surprise, combined with massed armor, was expected to achieve the breakthrough that had eluded British forces for 3 years of attritional warfare. Hetherington requested combat assignment, arguing that his training role, while important, had become routine. He wanted to test the new tactics and equipment under actual battle conditions, to validate the improvements that had been made since Daredevil's action at Fleur's tank corps. Headquarters initially denied the request, considering his training expertise too valuable to risk. But Hetherington was persistent, and he had allies among senior commanders who understood the importance of experienced leadership in this unprecedented operation. On November 10th, he received orders to command a tank company in the assault, leading 9 Mark IV tanks against German positions near the village of Flesquières. The assignment placed him at one of the most critical points in the offensive, where the Hindenburg Line's defenses were strongest. German engineers had constructed elaborate obstacles, including wide trenches specifically designed to trap tanks, concrete bunkers housing anti-tank guns, and carefully prepared fields of fire for artillery. The crew assigned to Hetherington's tank, designated Defiant, were all veterans of previous actions. They knew his reputation and understood that serving under his command meant accepting exceptional risk. The commander's position in Defiant was occupied by Lieutenant Henry Morrison, a former schoolteacher from Yorkshire who had commanded tanks at 3rd Ypres. When Morrison learned he would serve as Hetherington's second-in-command, he wrote to his wife, "I am to serve under the great man himself. It is an honor, though I confess some trepidation. Hetherington's courage borders on the suicidal, and I fear his crew members must match his disregard for personal safety." The assault began at 6:20 in the morning on November 20th. Unlike the Somme attack, where tanks had struggled across broken ground in small numbers, the Cambrai offensive deployed massed armor advancing behind a sophisticated artillery barrage that targeted German gun positions and communication networks. The tanks rolled forward in formation, crushing barbed wire beneath their tracks, providing mobile cover for infantry following close behind. Defiant advanced in the second wave, tasked with exploiting the breakthrough created by the first assault echelon. Through his improved vision ports, Hetherington could see the battle unfolding with unprecedented clarity. The first wave of tanks had smashed through the German forward positions, and British infantry were pouring through the gaps. For the first time since trench warfare had solidified, mobile operations seemed possible. The breakthrough that generals had dreamed of for 3 years appeared within reach. But the German army of late 1917 was not the force that had faced the first tanks at the Somme. They had developed anti-tank tactics, trained artillery crews to target the slow-moving vehicles, and deployed armor-piercing ammunition specifically designed to penetrate tank armor. As Defiant approached the German second line near Flesquières, enemy artillery began firing direct shots at the advancing tanks. The first tank in Hetherington's company exploded, struck squarely by a high-velocity shell that penetrated the armor and ignited ammunition inside. The vehicle erupted in flames, and none of the crew escaped. A second tank took a direct hit that sheared off one of its tracks, leaving it immobilized and vulnerable. German infantry rushed forward with grenades and flamethrowers, attempting to destroy the disabled vehicle before its crew could escape. Hetherington ordered Defiant toward the disabled tank, using his vehicle to shield it from German infantry while the crew evacuated. The maneuver exposed Defiant to concentrated fire from German positions, and shells began striking around them with disturbing accuracy. A near miss showered the tank with shrapnel, puncturing the fuel tank, the same catastrophic damage that had nearly destroyed Daredevil a year earlier. "Sir, we're leaking fuel," Morrison shouted over the engine noise. "We need to evacuate." Hetherington's response was immediate and unequivocal. "The crew of that disabled tank needs cover. We hold position until they're clear." What followed was a desperate 3-minute standoff that embodied everything Hetherington had come to represent in the tank. Corps Defiant remained stationary, its guns firing at German positions while fuel streamed from the damaged tank. The crew from the disabled vehicle ran across the open ground, reaching the relative safety of a shell crater. German artillery continued targeting Defiant, which had become a stationary target, offering German gunners an opportunity they rarely received. Doctrine written in blood, a shell struck Defiant's rear section, and the tank lurched violently. Hetherington was thrown against the commander's position, feeling his ribs crack from the impact. The explosion had damaged the engine, and flames erupted immediately from the fuel leak. For the second time in his combat career, he found himself commanding a burning tank while under concentrated enemy fire. The parallel to Daredevil was not lost on him, but this time the situation was arguably worse. The German artillery at Cambrai was more accurate, the anti-tank tactics more sophisticated, and the volume of fire far heavier. As flames spread through Defiant's interior, approaching the ammunition storage, Hetherington made a decision that contradicted his own evacuation orders. The tank carried 18 6-pounder shells in its ammunition compartment, and if fire reached them, the explosion would kill anyone still inside and likely wound infantry taking cover nearby. Someone needed to manually extract the shells and throw them clear of the vehicle before they detonated from heat exposure. "Proceed with evacuation," Hetherington ordered. "I'll handle the ammunition." Morrison, recognizing his commander's intent, refused. "Sir, that's a two-man job at minimum. You can't." "That's an order, Lieutenant. Get the crew out now." The standoff lasted perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity, while flames crept closer to high explosives. Morrison finally nodded and began directing the crew's evacuation. They exited through the side doors in disciplined sequence, each man moving immediately to cover positions where they could provide supporting fire for their exposed comrades. The evacuation took 90 seconds from first exit to last man clear, except for Hetherington, who remained inside the burning tank. Working alone in the smoke-filled interior, he began the desperate task of removing shells from the ammunition racks. Each 6-pounder round weighed 28 pounds, and the metal casings were already hot to the touch. Hetherington used a torn section of uniform as improvised insulation, grabbing each shell and passing it through the gun port where Morrison, who had refused to fully evacuate, grabbed them and threw them into a shell crater away from the tank and infantry positions. German observers had noticed the evacuation and intensified their fire. Machine gun bullets sparked off Defiant's armor, and another artillery shell struck nearby, showering both men with debris. Morrison took shrapnel in his arm but continued retrieving shells from Hetherington. They worked with the desperate speed of men who understood that any moment might bring catastrophic detonation. "Last 3 shells." "Sir," Morrison shouted. "For God's sake, come out." Hetherington reached for the final shells, and as his hand closed around the hot metal casing, the ammunition compartment's wooden storage rack burst into flames. The fire that had been creeping through the tank's interior suddenly became an inferno, fed by the dried wood and residual propellant. Hetherington grabbed the last shell, shoved it through the gun port into Morrison's waiting hands, and turned toward the exit. The explosion that followed was not the catastrophic detonation of ammunition, but rather the violent eruption of the fuel tank as fire reached the main reservoir. The blast threw Hetherington forward, slamming him against the tank's interior wall. He felt his left arm break, heard his own ribs crack, and tasted blood in his mouth. Through vision that swam with gray spots, he crawled toward the exit hatch, each movement sending waves of agony through his damaged body. Morrison, despite his own injuries, reached into the burning tank and grabbed Hetherington's uniform collar, dragging him through the exit. They tumbled together into the mud, rolling away from Defiant as flames engulfed the vehicle completely. British infantry rushed forward, providing covering fire while medical orderlies pulled both officers toward the safety of captured German trenches. The Battle of Cambrai continued for another 10 days, achieving initial success before German counterattacks stabilized the front. The massive tank offensive had proven that armored breakthrough was possible, though the operation's ultimate failure to achieve lasting territorial gains revealed that tanks alone could not win battles. They required infantry support, artillery coordination, and logistical backing that British forces were still learning to provide. Hetherington's injuries were severe enough to end his combat career. A broken arm, 4 cracked ribs, a fractured collarbone, severe burns on his hands and forearms, and smoke inhalation damage to his lungs left him hospitalized for 6 weeks. Military doctors informed him that further exposure to the conditions inside tanks would likely cause permanent respiratory damage. At 34 years old, having commanded tanks in 2 major battles and survived conditions that killed most men, Hetherington's frontline service was finished. The official citation for his Victoria Cross, approved in January of 1918, read in part, "Commander Thomas George Hetherington displayed exceptional valor and leadership under extreme combat conditions. Despite catastrophic damage to his vehicle and at grave personal risk, he remained in action to support infantry operations and personally ensured the safe evacuation of his crew. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and demonstrate extraordinary devotion to duty." Winston Churchill personally presented the decoration during a ceremony at Buckingham Palace on March 8, 1918. King George V, in an unusual breach of protocol, engaged Hetherington in extended conversation about tank warfare, expressing particular interest in the human factors that made armored operations possible. The king, according to court records, was fascinated by the fact that a former electrician had become one of Britain's most decorated tank commanders, viewing it as evidence of the war's democratizing effect on British society. But Hetherington's most significant contribution to the war effort came after his combat injuries forced him into advisory roles. Promoted to colonel and appointed as chief technical advisor to the Tank Corps, he spent the final year of the war synthesizing combat experience into doctrine. His manual, Armored Warfare, Principles and Practice, published in July of 1918, became the foundational text for tank operations in armies around the world. The document that Hetherington produced during his recovery was unlike any military manual previously published by the British Army. Rather than focusing solely on mechanical specifications and tactical formations, armored warfare principles and practice addressed the psychological, physical, and organizational challenges of commanding armored vehicles in combat. It was, in essence, a philosophical treatise on the nature of mechanized warfare written by someone who had experienced its worst horrors firsthand. The manual's opening chapter, titled The Human Element in Mechanical Warfare, acknowledged truths that most military theorists had avoided. Hetherington wrote, "The tank is not a fortress but a crucible. It tests men more severely than any previous instrument of war. Commanders must understand that crew effectiveness depends less on technical proficiency than on psychological resilience. A man who can operate a tank's controls in training may prove utterly useless in combat if he has not been prepared for the sensory assault, the heat, the claustrophobia, and the helplessness that define the tank crew's experience." This focus on human factors represented a radical departure from traditional military thinking. British doctrine in 1918 still emphasized the moral qualities of courage and discipline as abstract virtues. Hetherington, drawing from his electrical engineering background and his combat experience, approached human performance as an engineering problem requiring practical solutions. He recommended specific training regimens to build heat tolerance, advocated for crew rotation during extended operations, and detailed methods for maintaining morale under extreme conditions. The manual's tactical sections reflected lessons purchased with British lives during 2 years of tank warfare. Hetherington emphasized the principle of combined arms operations, arguing that tanks could not operate effectively without infantry, artillery, and logistical support. He detailed the coordination required between tank commanders and infantry officers, noting that successful operations demanded constant communication and mutual understanding of each branch's capabilities and limitations. Particularly prescient was Hetherington's analysis of anti-tank warfare. Having faced increasingly sophisticated German anti-tank tactics at Cambrai, he predicted that future armies would develop specialized weapons and tactics to counter armored vehicles. The manual included detailed recommendations for minimizing vulnerability, avoiding predictable routes, maintaining movement whenever possible, using terrain for concealment, and coordinating with artillery to suppress anti-tank positions before exposure. Military historians would later recognize the manual as one of the first comprehensive theories of armored warfare, predating the more famous works of Fuller and Littleheart. But in 1918, its immediate impact was practical rather than theoretical. Tank Corps commanders in France received copies and used them to improve operational effectiveness during the final offensives of the war. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning in August of 1918, saw tanks employed with unprecedented effectiveness, and much of that success could be traced to doctrines that Hetherington had codified. Yet the manual's most controversial section dealt with a topic that made senior officers uncomfortable: the limits of human endurance. Hetherington argued, based on his own experiences, that tank crews could not maintain combat effectiveness for extended periods. He recommended maximum crew exposure of 4 hours during intensive combat operations, with mandatory rest periods afterward. This ran counter to traditional military culture, which viewed endurance as a matter of willpower rather than physiology. A tank crew that has fought for 6 hours straight is combat ineffective regardless of their courage or determination, Hetherington wrote. The human body cannot function in temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit while performing complex mechanical operations under extreme stress. Commanders who ignore these physiological limits will find their most experienced crews dead from heat stroke or carbon monoxide poisoning, not enemy action. The recommendation met resistance from officers who viewed it as coddling soldiers, but events proved Hetherington correct. Tank crews pushed beyond their physiological limits, suffered disproportionate casualties from accidents and mistakes rather than enemy fire. By autumn of 1918, most tank battalions had adopted rotation schedules similar to those Hetherington advocated, and combat effectiveness improved measurably. During this period, Hetherington also worked closely with industrial designers to improve tank habitability. He consulted with automotive engineers about ventilation systems, collaborated with medical researchers studying heat tolerance, and even corresponded with industrial safety experts about protecting workers in extreme environments. This interdisciplinary approach was unusual for a military officer, but it reflected Hetherington's fundamental belief that technology and human factors were inseparable. One innovation he championed was the development of improved crew protection equipment. Early tank crews had worn standard infantry uniforms, which provided no protection against the specific hazards of armored warfare. Hetherington advocated for specialized clothing, leather helmets to protect against head injuries when crews were thrown against metal surfaces, fire-resistant gloves, and goggles to shield eyes from metal splinters. Many of these suggestions were implemented in time for the war's final campaigns, and they significantly reduced crew injuries. His influence extended beyond British forces. American tank units, arriving in France during 1918, studied his manual and incorporated its recommendations into their training. French tank commanders who had developed armored doctrine independently found Hetherington's emphasis on human factors complemented their own tactical theories. Even German intelligence reports from late 1918 referenced the British officer whose writing had systematized armored warfare doctrine with unprecedented thoroughness. The armistice of November 11, 1918 found Hetherington at Tank Corps' headquarters in France, working on revisions to his manual based on lessons from the final offensives. The war's end brought mixed emotions. Relief at the cessation of slaughter competed with grief for the hundreds of tank crewmen who had died under his command or following his doctrines. He had helped create a new form of warfare, one that had saved countless infantry lives by breaking the stalemate of trench warfare, but he had also seen the human cost of fighting inside metal machines that were simultaneously shelter and death trap. The years following the Great War transformed Thomas Hetherington from a combat commander into an elder statesman of armored warfare, though the transition brought challenges that battlefield courage could not overcome. In March of 1919, he testified before a parliamentary committee investigating British military procurement and doctrine. The hearing, held in the ornate chambers of Westminster, placed the former electrician in front of generals, admirals, and politicians who were already rewriting the war's narrative. Hetherington's testimony was characteristically blunt. When asked whether the tank program had been worth its substantial cost, he responded, "If you measure worth in pounds sterling against German trenches captured, the calculation is complex. If you measure worth in British lives saved compared to traditional infantry assaults, the tanks paid for themselves 1,000 times over. Every tank crew that burned to death saved dozens of infantry soldiers who would have died charging machine gun positions." The answer offended some committee members, who felt Hetherington was being inappropriately mercenary about British casualties. But his point resonated with junior officers attending the hearing, men who had commanded infantry in France and understood exactly what he meant. The tank had not been a perfect weapon, but it had finally provided an answer to the defensive dominance of machine guns and barbed wire. However, the post-war British military, facing severe budget cuts and institutional resistance to change, was not universally enthusiastic about armored warfare. Many senior officers viewed tanks as a temporary expedient necessitated by trench warfare's unique conditions. They argued that traditional cavalry and infantry would remain dominant in future conflicts. Hetherington found himself defending not just the tanks themselves but the entire concept of mechanized warfare against critics who wanted to return to pre-war orthodoxy. Teaching suited him. Students found his lectures compelling because he could relate abstract engineering principles to concrete life-or-death situations. When discussing heat transfer, he described the desperate attempts to cool Daredevil's engine while under fire. Lessons on materials science incorporated experiences with armor that had saved his life and armor that had failed his fellow tank commanders. He transformed engineering education from pure theory into practical problem-solving, always emphasizing that machines existed to serve human purposes. His former crew members maintained contact over the decades. Private Atkinson, whose hands had been so badly burned driving Daredevil, became a bus driver in London, adapting to his injuries with prosthetic aids. Corporal Davies returned to Wales and opened a garage servicing automobiles with skills learned maintaining tank engines. Lieutenant Morrison taught at a grammar school in Yorkshire, occasionally visiting Manchester to attend Hetherington's lectures. These men, bound by shared trauma and triumph, formed a brotherhood that persisted long after the war ended. The 1930s brought renewed military interest in tanks as international tensions increased. Germany, rearming under the National Socialist government, developed armored doctrines influenced by Hetherington's writings, though they extended his theories in ways he had not anticipated. The concept of blitzkrieg rapid mechanized warfare combining tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry represented an evolution of principles he had first articulated after Flers and Cambrai. British military officials sought his advice as war approached again. In 1938, now in his 50s and suffering from emphysema, Hetherington toured tank development facilities and training centers, comparing modern machines to the crude vehicles he had commanded 2 decades earlier. The tanks of 1938 were faster, better armed, more reliable, but he worried whether the new generation of tank commanders understood the human factors that made armored warfare possible. "The machines have improved tremendously," he told an interviewer from the Manchester Guardian in February of 1939. "But I wonder if we're adequately preparing the men who must fight in them." Technology advances faster than human adaptation. The psychological challenges of commanding a tank in combat remain what they were in 1916. Heat, claustrophobia, sensory overload, these don't change because engines become more powerful. World War II began in September of 1939, and Hetherington volunteered to return to military service despite his age and health. The War Office politely declined, instead appointing him as a civilian advisor to tank training programs. He spent the war years visiting training facilities, observing exercises, and consulting with commanders preparing for armored operations. His influence was indirect but significant, as many senior tank commanders in the British Army had either served under him or been trained according to doctrines he had established. The war vindicated his theories about mechanized warfare while also revealing his limitations. Tanks proved decisive in North Africa, France, and Russia, achieving the mobile warfare he had predicted. But they were also vulnerable in ways he had not fully anticipated. Anti-tank weapons had evolved dramatically, and the tank warfare of 1940 to 1945 was far more lethal than what he had experienced on the Somme and at Cambrai. The crews still endured heat, claustrophobia, and terror, but now they faced shape-charged weapons that could penetrate armor and incinerate everyone inside. Thomas George Hetherington died on December 3, 1946, in Manchester, aged 63. His lungs, damaged by years of breathing superheated, toxic air inside burning tanks, finally gave out. He was buried with full military honors at Southern Cemetery, his coffin draped with the Union flag and escorted by veterans of the Tank Corps wearing their Great War medals. Among the mourners were dozens of former tank crewmen, men who had survived the war because of training and doctrines he had developed. The obituaries in British newspapers struggled to adequately summarize his contributions. The Times called him the father of British tank warfare, noting that his influence extended far beyond his combat actions. The Manchester Guardian emphasized his working-class origins and rapid rise through merit rather than privilege. Tank Corps veterans writing in service journals emphasized something else: his willingness to ask of others only what he first demanded of himself, his refusal to send men into danger he would not face personally. But perhaps his most lasting legacy was not tactical or technical. Hetherington had demonstrated that modern warfare required a new type of officer, technically proficient, willing to innovate, focused on solving practical problems rather than maintaining tradition. The electrician who became a tank commander represented a shift in military culture from aristocratic amateurism toward professional expertise. That shift, more than any specific tactical innovation, shaped 20th-century military development. The tanks Hetherington commanded are now museum pieces, displayed at Bovington and the Imperial War Museum. Daredevil's burned hulk was recovered from the Somme battlefield in 1919 and partially restored for display. Visitors can peer through the narrow vision slits and try to imagine spending 3 hours inside during combat, though the static museum environment cannot replicate the heat, noise, fumes, and terror that define the tank crew's experience. In 1966, the 50th anniversary of the Somme offensive, military historians organized conferences examining the battle's significance. Hetherington's role received renewed attention, with scholars analyzing his tactical decisions and their impact on armored warfare development. Several of his former crew members, now elderly themselves, attended these conferences, sharing memories of the man who had led them through hell and somehow brought most of them home. The story of the Navy electrician who built a suicidal fire tank and then shocked everyone by fighting in it himself became part of British military mythology. It was taught at Sandhurst and used in training programs to illustrate principles of leadership under extreme conditions. But the mythology sometimes obscured the human reality. A working-class engineer who saw a problem, developed a solution, and had the courage to test that solution with his own life. What separated Hetherington from other visionary officers was not superior intellect or tactical brilliance, but rather his fundamental integrity. He could not ask others to face dangers he would not share. That simple principle, acted upon consistently even when it meant climbing into burning tanks, earned him a loyalty that transcended rank and class. His crews followed him not because military discipline required it, but because his actions demonstrated that he valued their lives as highly as his own. The British Army of 1916 had been an institution divided by class, where officers from public schools commanded working-class soldiers with whom they had little in common. Hetherington, with one foot in each world, helped bridge that divide. He proved that technical expertise earned through practical experience could be as valuable as classical education and aristocratic breeding. In doing so, he helped transform not just tank warfare but military culture itself. Today, a small memorial in Manchester honors his contributions. The plaque describes him simply as Thomas George Hetherington, VCDSO, Royal Navy and Tank Corps, 1982 to 1946. He led by example and never asked others to face dangers he would not share. It is a modest tribute for a man whose innovations saved thousands of lives and whose courage inspired a generation of armored warfare pioneers. But perhaps the most fitting memorial exists not in bronze or stone, but in the doctrines and traditions of armored forces worldwide. Every time tank crews train for the psychological challenges of combat, every time commanders emphasize crew welfare alongside tactical effectiveness, every time armies recognize that technology requires human adaptation, Hetherington's legacy persists. The electrician who climbed into a burning tank at Flers and refused to abandon it at Cambrai established standards of leadership that transcend his era and his nation. His story reminds us that courage takes many forms. It appears in the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, to champion unpopular innovations, to learn from failure, and to accept personal risk in pursuit of ideas one believes will save others. Hetherington possessed all these qualities, but above all, he demonstrated that true leadership means going first into the fire, literally and figuratively, before asking others to follow.